Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński and you're watching Break the Fake. They make them, we break them, and tell you everything you need to know. Imagine traveling across Russia. Sure, you probably wouldn't want to in the current circumstances unless you fancy your travel plans being interrupted by a letter calling you to the front line, but if you wanted to, you would probably wish to stop by in a region called Karelia. Bordering with Finland, it features a picturesque lake known as Ladoga, a place where little islets cluster among the greenery. One of them, Vladimir, recently hosted guests of a rather high-profile type, a little summit one might call Dictators Without Borders, featuring none other than Vladimir Putin and Alexander Lukashenko. Enjoying the tranquility of a local monastery with seagulls cawing and sanctions pounding on their heads, presumably, the leaders of Russia and Belarus decided to sit down for informal dialogue. And as always, the main themes included the obvious: territories, obviously, Ukraine and the West. And also everyone's favorite missile of ancient myth, the Areshnik. Let's take a look. Afterwards, the self-proclaimed Belarusian president spoke about the negotiation process for a peace agreement with Ukraine. Lukashenko claimed that Russians will slowly gnaw at all of Ukraine's territory like a hungry bear, and seize it and move on. But the Kremlin leader stepped in to, believe it or not, correct him. You see, in Putin's imaginary world, Russia isn't seizing anything. It is, as he said, reclaiming territory. How so? Well, let's find out.
Украина сегодня бегом должна просить его: Владимир Владимирович, давайте сядем за стол переговоров, давайте договоримся. В противном случае, через несколько, месяц, полтора, два, не знаю, там вообще даже оборонительных сооружений не останется. Россияне все это потихонечку отгрызут, захватят и пойдут дальше, отвоюют.
Вернут.
Да.
Now, this exchange of remarks is not just an anecdote, it is the quintessence of Russian politics. In Putin's mind, the clock is moving rather erratically and mostly backwards. One day we're reliving the glory years of the Soviet Union. The other day we're actually in the 19th century. Putin wishes that Russia followed him on this journey of self-delusion, and to be fair, it often does, but not in the way he wants it to. In his imaginary time machine, he moves the selector switch to the Soviet era, thinking he would get Ukraine to rejoin, and he wakes up with Soviet-like economic woes instead. He flips the switch to 19th century Russian Empire and ends up with much of his people not having indoor plumbing in their homes. Talk about unintentional consequences. Meanwhile, Lukashenko also decided to join the 2025 political daydreaming cringe fest, claiming that if the European Union and Russia were to unite, that would be a force to be reckoned with. But the United States will never allow this to happen. How charming. Imagine an economy of over 17 trillion being even remotely interested in Putin's museum piece of a country, with overall GDP of a little over $2 trillion. Let's just say the European Union is out of Russia's league.
Союз. Как-то поговаривали, что такая цель у американцев тоже есть: ослабить этот центр силы, все-таки Европейский Союз. Не слабая была организация. Это и произойдет. А им надо было не таскаться с нами лоб в лоб, об этом тоже не раз говорил, а вместе быть. Вот Европейский Союз и Россия, вот эта мощь, если бы объединилась, то, конечно, никогда, наверное, американцы не смогут допустить, это страшно для них. Это страшнее, чем Китай бы было. Если бы это объединить, это было бы силище. Но они этого не понимают. Да им, наверное, и не надо. Я смотрю на этих лидеров, не хочу при Владимире Владимировиче их характеризовать. Некоторые уже уходят, как их называют, хромые утки, другие только пришли.
The European Union is based on the rule of law, freedom of speech, market economy and transparency. Russia is based on Putin, propaganda, repressions and oil sales. But Lukashenko stubbornly repeats the mantra that if the European Union and Russia were to unite, they would be that mythical force to beat pretty much everyone across the world. One has to assume that in Lukashenko's imagination, it would be Western Europe learning from Moscow and not the other way around. Imagine a Russia where you can enjoy human rights, or Google the Kremlin's real casualty rates in Ukraine without the FSB knocking on your door. If the European Union were to embrace Russia's civilization model instead, rest assured it would not be the geopolitical Godzilla that Lukashenko keeps dreaming of, but rather a corrupt, post-communist potato farm of a continent, a bit like Belarus itself. I guess the Europeans hardly need to have the White House telling them that this is not a good idea. In all this madness, there is one good thing though. If Putin and Lukashenko want a rerun of the geopolitical sitcom known as the Soviet Union, then I can only say we might be close to the thrilling climax of the final season. Reports indicate Russia wants to do an arms race with the West, spending over $1 trillion over the next decade to replenish its Soviet-era stocks, which have either rusted out or been reduced to scrap metal in Ukraine. Spoiler alert! Last time an arms race with the West happened, the Soviet economy was the principal casualty. So yeah, enjoy the series finale. We definitely will. Do you ever watch the news to hear the hosts telling you about casualties with a gleeful smile? In Russia, apparently, this is still a thing. Case in point, Russian TV host Ivan Pankin recently sharing his apparent satisfaction with how Russian forces hit the city of Kiev while doing his best impersonation of Hannibal Lecter after eating someone's liver with fava beans and a nice Chianti. However, he also added that Russia is, wait for it, deliberately hitting Ukraine at night so that no one gets hurt. Really? The latest victims of Russian strikes would beg to differ. Also, trying to convince the world your war crimes are there for humanitarian reasons is really stretching it, even by Russian standards.
Согласитесь, по Киеву прилетело, причем неплохо. Всю ночь по лучшим телеграм-домам распространялись видеозаписи, и я обратил внимание на интересный момент. Смотрите, а мы действительно, вот я даже не помню, когда наши удары по Украине, по тылу я имею в виду, по каким-то объектам, были в дневное время. А вот что-то не припомню, потому что мы давным-давно не бьем в дневное время по объектам на Украине, только ночью. Но все это объясняется тем, что днем больше народу и может кого-то зацепить. Зачем это нужно? Вот Украина, в свою очередь, бьет в любое время суток, ну и в любое время года, понятное дело. Когда может, тогда и бьет. Куда может дотянуться, туда и бьет.
Against this backdrop, it is even hard to say what is more dangerous now. Missiles flying from the Belgorod region of Russia or information projectiles flying at you from a Moscow studio. Russian propaganda has never been big on self-restraint, but the latest stuff is really veering into the Rwandan radio genocide territory. Mr. Pankin seems to be trying to score points in the eyes of his masters at the Kremlin through cynicism, callousness, and complete disregard for human life. And I guess it's the kind of entertainment that tickles Vladimir Putin's fancy. And, you know, I mentioned the Rwanda case for a reason here. Back then, the radio hosts would say the most horrific things on air, urging their audience to essentially engage in acts of violence. They did not, however, escape liability, with many of them getting lengthy prison sentences in the end. Today, there is still reports of Russian propagandists enjoying opulent lifestyles of European travel and real estate ownership. If we consider enticement to war crimes and genocide made on air to be rather disgusting, perhaps we should also get those sanctions rolling against the people that actually do those things, right? Sad Vladimir Solovyov noises after the EU seized his luxury home in Italy were definitely worth the effort back then, so perhaps more of the same could make a difference to make sure that all these guys at Russian state TV know that they will not be doing this stuff with impunity. And with this, we conclude this edition of Break the Fake. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.